Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kev Baker, coming to you live from Glasgow, Scotland, and you are, of course, tuned in to the Truth Frequency Radio Network, www.tfrlive.com. Now, you might be listening out there on iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio app, so many different ways to listen to the show, but I honestly can't thank each and every one of you enough. And from time to time, a rare treat comes along. And last year, I came across a guest that really blew my mind. And judging by the response of some of the audience out there, really blew your mind as well. And there was a big kind of cry to get this guy back. And I am so glad because tonight he is back. And what great timing, because even at the start of this year, 2019, so much space news coming our way. We've had Ultimate Thule out in the Kuiper Belt, the Deep Horizons mission. We've also had the Chang'e 4, Jade Rabbit 2, the Far Side of the Moon stuff with China. More news on fast radio bursts. Oumuamua, that asteroid, comet, whatever it is, just won't go away. And there, as you heard on the news before the show starting, even the Hubble telescope in the news, it started up again after being out of commission for a week. So I think this is the perfect time to welcome back to the show astrophysicist Dr. Brian Keating. Now, for anyone who doesn't know who Brian is, he's a professor of physics at the University of California, San Diego. Now, he has lectured on 6 of the 7 continents, and get this, even including Antarctica. He is an expert in the study of the universe's oldest light, the cosmic microwave background, which he uses to investigate the origin and evolution of the universe. Now, Brian is also a pioneer in the search for the earliest physical evidence of the inflationary epoch, the theorized period of expansion of space in the early universe directly in the moments after the Big Bang. Now, physicists predict that this evidence will reveal itself as a particular pattern in the way CMB light is polarized. This pattern is referred to as a B-mode pattern, and Brian designed the first experiment dedicated to detecting it. Now, what happened next during a purported detection of this long-sought signal led to Brian writing the book Losing the Nobel Prize. We'll be hearing a bit about that in a moment as well, seeing how the book's going before getting into a lot of new stuff. But interestingly enough, Brian is also the co-associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and he hosts a podcast called Into the Impossible that covers all of the stuff that we get into here on the Kev Baker Show, topics like the worlds of arts, sciences, humanities, engineering, and medicine, on the nature of imagination and how, through speculative culture, we collaborate to create the future. So, without any more time wasted from me, Brian, welcome back, sir. It's great to have you.
Kev, it's great to be back on the show with you.
No, it really is. And since we last spoke, you were telling me your book, Losing the Nobel Prize, and maybe you'll just want to recap on that for any new listeners out there. But this is up for some awards now, right?
Yeah, surprisingly, it did not win the Nobel Prize in Literature. That was a big shock because I thought by criticizing the Nobel Prize committees and their seemingly, to some of us, conspiratorial practices, that would surely net me a Nobel Prize in Literature. But alas, that was not to be this year.
It might have shown that a sense of humor if they'd given you that.
I know, yeah. Well, they're very, it was shown they have thick skins. But actually, nobody won the Nobel Prize in Literature this year. So if you ever hear of somebody, as often comes up, so-and-so just barely lost out on the Nobel Prize in mathematics, say, that will should raise alarms for you, because there is a Nobel Prize in mathematics, and there are various speculations on why that's the case. But nevertheless, not only is there no Nobel Prize in mathematics, but there will never be a Nobel Prize in Literature for the year 2018. And some say it may not be given away in 2019 either. And so part of that, I don't think it was a direct response to my book, although I was pleased to see after we spoke that not only did my book receive a lot of attention from the Nobel Academy itself, the Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Nobel Royal Academy in Sweden, But it also received, as you mentioned, about 6 or 7 of the most sort of respected science book awards of the year, including on Amazon, on Science News, Forbes. It was selected by Forbes magazine as well here. So it's been very gratifying and a little bit ironic, for a book about losing out on an award to win some awards. But it definitely is nice to get recognition from both critics, but in reality, it's been the readers, the lay people, especially the young scientists, male and female, that are really resonating with what the book describes, which is a very intimate portrait of what it's like to try to do science at the highest levels. And
like we were describing last time, and again, there might be new listeners here. I mean, you were basically caught up in a bit of drama because, like I was saying in the introduction, you really did think that you were detecting these long sought after patterns, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We had set out to detect what would turn out to be perhaps one of the most elusive astronomy, which I should point out, you're mentioning all these great breakthroughs in astronomy, the study of astronomy, and all the more so when you Sorry, I got disconnected there. You still there?
I'm still here, Brian. Yeah,
great.
It went a little bit choppy there because you were talking about the major discoveries in astronomy, and then it all went a bit funny.
Yeah, astronomy is a challenge, because we of a star, or we're not able to, to actually go to another planet with the laboratories to study it. And so we have to make do with whatever comes to us or whatever we're able to do with our telescopes and space probes. So the fact that we're enjoying this golden age of astronomy, as you point out, is quite remarkable. And that's a big theme in the book of discovery for its own sake, not for the mere acquisition of human accolades.
Yeah, absolutely, because as somebody who's always been interested in space, it feels like right now in my lifetime, this is the most active we've ever been. You can look at the private side of it, from SpaceX to all these other countries that are now having successful space programs. I think it's fantastic.
Absolutely, yeah. It's great to see that, astronomy belongs to everybody, and it's in some sense bristle when I tell them that, we enjoy this proud heritage of who among us.
Brian, I'm going to try and reconnect with you because it keeps on cutting out every couple of seconds. So I'll disconnect.
Give me a call right back.
No probs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Hopefully we'll get Brian back in just a moment, folks. But I don't want you to miss any of this information. So that's why I really kind of jumped in quickly there. Because just like all of you out there tonight, I'm in pure listener mode.
Hello?
There we go. You sound loud and clear now, Brian. Are you there?
Hello?
Are you there, Brian?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello?
I can. Oh, no, Brian can't hear us. I'll try and disconnect again, folks. Stand by. Bear with me, folks. We'll try this. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for the connection problems we're having so far. I do assure you that Brian is in San Diego tonight. At least I believe he is. I don't think he's up on the moon or maybe, down in Antarctica where he likes to hang out sometimes. But hopefully in just a moment, we will get back to Brian and his book, Losing the Nobel Prize. What happened was they thought with the experiment, the bicep experiment that they were running down on the South Pole, they thought they detected this long predicted pattern. And what had actually happened was...
Now I hear you.
Can you hear me now, Brian?
Now I do, yes.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. I'm glad we got it cleared up early because I don't want any of the audience to miss any of this good stuff we're getting into. But yeah, we were kind of talking about the golden age of astronomy that we're entering right now.
Yeah, and how so many different countries around the world are looking to the heavens as human beings have done for millennia now. And it's all the more gratifying to see it when it makes the news, because we're so inundated by awful news politically and otherwise. And I know you over there in the UK are dealing with your own political ramifications of Brexit, say, for example. And what's nice about astronomy is that there's no remain or leave. There's no Republican constellations versus Democrat constellations. And what's so gratifying to me about that is that you can pursue it for the truth and investigate it to broaden our appreciation for this magical cosmos that we live in.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And while we were getting reconnected there, I kind of explained to the audience about how when you had been doing the BICEP experiment down in Antarctica, what had really happened was what you thought was the signal you were looking for really ended up, or a lot of the team ended up in that thing called confirmation bias, where it looked like what you were looking for, and basically you wanted it to be what you were looking for, but it didn't quite turn out that way, did it?
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes when a person, and despite all stereotypes, scientists are people too, right? And in our case, we had a notion that if we had discovered this signal from the Big Bang's earliest moments, that we'd really be pushing the boundaries of human knowledge back, in the words of the famed physicist Lawrence Krauss, further back than had ever been increased in all of human history, on the day of the announcement in March of 2014. And along with those announcements of proclamations of scientific discovery came predictions of Nobel Prizes for many of the team. And it's so pernicious in my mind that great scientific discoveries, have to be capstoned by this earthly award, which is given out by 300 mostly white guys in Sweden that make this award what it is. Not to say that the winners of the award do not deserve it. I think that in most cases they do. However, the fact that it becomes sort of like a grade or the ultimate way of evaluation tends to increase the propensity for these negative prejudices to come about. And one of them is confirmation bias. And I always say, it was certainly a driving force in me in my early career that I wanted to succeed, and that would be the ultimate, most tangible way of accrediting my success. And so I do think, though, that scientists are people, and we are subject to the same biases and prejudices as any other group of human individuals. And one of the most dangerous ones is confirmation bias.
No, absolutely. And if people want to catch up on the full story of that one, they can go, and I'll include the link to that show in the description after this podcast is actually posted. But, I want to move on to some of the stuff I was looking at today. And I mentioned that you work with and I love the name of this place, the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, which I think makes you the perfect guest to come on here, all the topics you get into. And I heard you speaking to somebody called Andy Weir. Now, people out there might not be aware who Andy Weir is, but he's the author of The Martian, which became a really popular film, and also another book that I really enjoyed listening to, and that was Artemis. And this was about a lunar colony. Now, with all this news about China being on the far side of the moon and stuff like that, Brian, I think it makes it quite timely to bring up your ideas about colonization of the moon further beyond that. What do you think? What's the timescale, if at all?
Yeah, well, that is a fascinating subject, and Andy Weir's book explores the motivation for it. And I won't give away any spoilers, but I will say the main motivation, which he gets into very early on, for inhabiting the moon, in his opinion, is purely economic, and in that not for exploitation of minerals and so forth, but really for tourism. And it's hard to argue with that. There are some other well-done science fiction accounts, as Artemis is, of future utopia, dystopias in space, inhabiting other worlds, including a relatively new show called The Expanse, which we get here in the U.S. I'm not sure it's available there, but that's about inhabiting the asteroid belt. And the question of why you'd want to do something like that, it typically will come down to a question of economics. I mean, after all, that was the reason that exploration took place on the surface of the Earth. Now, you have to ask yourself, if the cost-benefit analysis comes out in favor of actual exploration. I don't agree that there's any point really in pursuing inhabiting the moon as a secondary planet for once we destroy Earth or something like that, or Mars. There are certainly other alternatives much, much closer to home, literally on Earth, to do so. But the question of, what would it be used for? I think there are scientific purposes. I'll point out that, in the 50 years now, this is the 50th year anniversary of the landing on the moon, we have not been back. And the question of, would we leave a resource behind completely unexplored for generations, literally 2 generations, is an important question to ask. And I always point out the fact that human beings, including, the British explorer Robert Scott, reached Antarctica, reached the South Pole in Antarctica exactly, 107 years ago. Yesterday, actually, was the anniversary of his reaching the South Pole. And when he got there, he found a Norwegian flag staring him in the face. That must have been one of the most disappointing events in human history, akin to, Neil Armstrong stepping out of the Eagle lander onto a Russian flag. That kind of.
It would have been right up there with the Russian
flag.
But,
the fact is we didn't go back to the South Pole for another 40 years.
Well, I think we're getting these pesky kind of interference problems again here. Not sure what it is.
What's that?
I'm not sure what's causing it this time.
Yeah, I'm in a hard line, a wired connection. So
it's weird. It must just be Skype. I hate Skype, really. I mean,
yeah, it's really a kind of subpar.
It's a bit like the NASA space program. It just doesn't seem to get any better year after year.
Yeah. So I was saying, how we have this notion that the moon is this great place, but we haven't been back in 50 years exactly. And why is that if there are advantages to it? So I think there are some cases for exploration for its own sake. I think that is an important thing. I think to look at it as a future abode for humanity is sort of far-fetched and certainly not likely to happen in the next 50 years or so. But I could be wrong and get surprised, and I'd be delighted to do so. I mean, that was one of my original entrees into astrophysics, was that I wanted to be an astronaut. And so I wanted to learn how to be a pilot, which I eventually became, and an astrophysicist, which I eventually became, but I never became an astronaut. And I think my wife and kids are glad that I didn't.
Absolutely, but with the likes of Elon Musk, he's taking the cost down for exploration, which I think has to be a good thing. That makes it a bit more viable economically. And the show you mentioned, The Expanse, I absolutely love that show. I spent far too much time wasted on geeking out on sci-fi shows, Brian. I really, really do. But when I was young, I used to I honestly thought that would be our reality right now. We would already be out there, doing the mining, doing stuff like that. And it's almost as if, as all other technology moved forward, really space, it kind of stagnated and stood still, right? Well, I think we're getting interference here for sure. So let me move on to another topic then, right? Let me try you with something else here. Because I was looking down the podcasts that you've done with the Arthur C. Clarke Institute, and there was podcasts on there. I'm not sure if you were a part of them, but they were about alien life. What's your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts on alien life?
Skeptic. I don't believe personally that you have to distinguish among, slime mold and virus, radio transmission, podcast, Skype, maybe life, but it certainly seems dubious to me. There was recently a book written by a similar, his name is Adam Frank, and he wrote a book, and it's a delightful book. Adam would make a good guest for your show too, and it's called Light of the Stars. And its thesis is that there's so much vastness in our universe, both in space and in time, that it's inevitable that not only one civilization like ours has existed, but maybe hundreds have existed. And that sounds like a lot, except when you consider the size of the observable universe is roughly 90 billion light years across, and it's existed for 14 billion years. And so if you take into account the existence of 100 civilizations in that vast, and he's an optimist about alien life, that would be, a very pitiful amount that you'd have no hope of ever discovering because most of the life forms would live in some of the other, 100 billion galaxies that exist in our universe, completely disconnected from ours in space and time. So I'm very...
Yeah, I've always said as well, I mean, even our idea of life, I mean, it's our idea of it. We've got our own set kind of concept and parameters on what life is, and it doesn't necessarily even need to be something that adheres to our commonly held belief, really, does it?
Exactly. I make that point in the book that, throughout scientific history, people have betrayed and belied this notion that whatever exists must be like us. So, for example, and it worked well, right? It worked well in the beginning when Galileo sort of proved the Copernican hypothesis that the Earth is just a planet like the other, at that time, 4 other planets that they knew about surrounding the sun. And then later that William Herschel, a British English astronomer, discovered that the galaxy is comprised of, innumerable stars. Later we found out from Hubble and others that our galaxy is one of innumerable other galaxies. So that seems to kind of keep portraying us as very common and very ordinary substance or entity in the universe. And I think if you continue that logic, you would say, well, then life must be common in the universe. But who's to say life is, as you say, anything like what we are familiar with? And it may be radically different than us. In fact, some, like Professor Max Tegmark, who's a friend of mine at MIT, suggest, perhaps the most common form of life in the universe is artificial life, artificial intelligence. I don't happen to agree with that, but I think it's an interesting perspective to consider. But
I think if the aliens, or if a craft, was, if a craft was ever to turn up, I think the likelihood is it would probably be some form of AI, just because of the vast distances and time involved in space travel, as we know them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scientist here, Craig Ventnor, who co-sequenced the human genome about 20 years ago now. And he has
Creepy Craig, as I like to call him. Yes, he's featured on a few of my shows.
Yeah, so he has this book, Life at the Speed of Light, where he talks about the propagation of DNA. It would be much easier to send, an exact duplicate of your DNA to Neptune than to actually send you to Neptune. And then if there's replication stations on Neptune, then you could replicate them. Now, you could say, well, what happens to the consciousness and the soul? And I just interviewed Sir Roger Penrose last week, and we were talking about just those very concepts. But the bottom line is, there's a difference between, a computer code and a human being. And we know it when we see it. We feel it when we feel it. And it's not the same. But that doesn't mean that, the replication of robots and some kind of artificial intelligence would not make the ideal explorer. I mean, we don't send people to Ultima Thule. We send robots. And why not do the same? And just imagine if you had a way station 3 billion miles from Earth where you could assemble Ultima, the New Horizons spacecraft, and that project could be assembled out there for less cost by a team of robots. I assume someday we'll do that. It doesn't imply that we'll make contact with that. Those are we would consider those to be alien intelligence, though. They'd be the properties of a superior intelligence, namely on Earth.
I absolutely agree with you. I can definitely see, space stuff going more robotic. The same as most jobs down here on terra firma as well, when you look at the robotics that are coming our way. But we're almost on the break, ladies and gentlemen. So I want people to head on over to briankeating.com. You can check out the book there, Losing the Nobel Prize. You can keep up to date with everything Brian is a part of. And I think I'll get your phone number maybe during the break, Brian, and call you. And that'll be a far better connection for the second part of the show. And you mentioned Dr. Roger Penrose there. Definitely somebody I'll be talking to you about after the break. So for everyone out there, stay tuned. We'll be back after these short messages for the second part of tonight's show with Dr. Brian Keating. And don't forget, coming up right after tonight's show, don't go anywhere, because my good friend Joe Joseph, he will be live on the Freedom Link. So please stay tuned for that. More on the way, right here on the Kev Baker Show with Dr. Brian Keating. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so before we launch back into tonight's show, let me just remind everyone that the Kev Baker Show is brought to you in association with getthetea.com. Yes, that's getthetea.com. Now, Ronnie McMullen is the man behind the company that is changing America one tea bag at a time. And let's just head on over and hear what Ronnie has to say about getthetea.com.
Times are changing. The circus of politics, healthcare's low standards and high prices, and let's not forget food quality. What to do? Arm yourself with Life Change Tea at getthetea.com. In a world of chemical imbalance and poor air and water quality, it's time you make a move. Log on to getthetea.com and stock up on organic non-GMO supplements. Don't forget the tea. Cleansing your body never felt so good. And we have a brand new tea called Takedown Tea, which helps support healthy glucose. All natural body support so you can be at your best, naturally. All you have to do is log on to getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. We're not a fad that comes and goes. We are the real deal. Join us and armor up. Getthetea.com. That's getthetea.com. Changing America's health one tea bag at a time.
So remember, folks, head on over there. Check out Get the Tea at getthetea.com. And remember to let Ronnie and the team know that you heard it here first on KBS. Let's get back into it. Part 2 of the Kev Baker Show with Dr. Brian Keating, astrophysicist and author of Losing the Nobel Prize. Now then, Brian, let's get right back into it. We've got a far better connection now. This is going to be absolutely brilliant. Not that the first part wasn't, but at least we won't get cut off all the time now. We mentioned you working on the BICEP project, and this was what led you to write the book, Losing the Nobel Prize. And I was asking you during the break, what is it you're actually working on now? And this really opens up the world of these big science projects that we hear about.
Yeah, so science is really, driven by a pursuit of seeing the invisible. The visible to us or an ordinary everyday experience is not really a subject of research, but it's very important, obviously, in medicine, the human body, physiology, et cetera. But to understand the inner workings of the atom and use that to understand the organization of the cosmos as a whole is a relatively new phenomenon that's driven by advances in very large collaborations and big projects and technology, which is sort of one of the competing reasons for writing the book as I did, in that the Nobel Prize recognizes at most 3 scientists, whereas the collaboration that I'm co-leading now, called the Simons Observatory, which will be a massive 6-meter diameter telescope located at 5,200-meter elevation in the Atacama Desert of Chile, which is a place that looks exactly like the surface of Mars. And this foreboding environment is really necessary to build a massive telescope in order to glimpse the wispy signals from the faint processes that took place at the very beginning of time. These are processes that involve the most mysterious entities in the universe: dark matter, dark energy, and perhaps even invisible phenomena known as gravitational waves, which have only recently been discovered. So we've opened a new window on the universe, and that window happens to let in, a very peculiar type of signal that can't be seen with the human senses. And so we have to build enormous machines in order to transduce and to transmutate these signals into a way that the human mind can comprehend. And that's what's so fascinating about the job that I get to do on a daily basis.
Absolutely, and I think we mentioned last time as well, if you could utilize the power of a quantum computer for all that data that's going to be pouring in via that telescope, it might come up with the patterns that even you hadn't kind of imagined yet, Brian. That's the kind of power of technology we have right now. And you mentioned that big project there, and one big science project I always talk about on the show here is CERN. It absolutely fascinates me and terrifies me all at the same time. And I was looking yesterday at a story where they're piling another $10 billion into this. And they're going from a 17-kilometre or 17-mile diameter ring, circumference, I'm not sure which one it is again. And they're going to 100 kilometres by the year 2040. Now, I was asking you in the emails, I said I was going to bring this up on the show. I mean, how much more do they have to smash particles together to find what they're after? Is there no end to this?
Yeah. So it's interesting. You gave the, like the used car salesman kind of price. They give you the the lowball price, and then they stick you for the undercoating and the pinstriping later on. So the actual price tag for all these things, first of all, whenever a scientist gives you a number, the very first thing you have to do is double it, because those price tags are always for the construction of the project. They don't account for the fact that you actually want to use this thing, right? So we don't build a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier just to build it. You have to figure in, and the rules of thumb vary, but typically about 10% of the construction cost each year to operate, to maintain it, to staff it. And so that means just 10% per year. In a decade, you're going to double the cost of it. Now, the low ball price that you quote, the $10 million US, is actually on the low side for the ambitious project that they'd like to build is about 21 billion euros. So you're talking perhaps 3 times as much money as originally specified. And again, that's just for construction. So by the time they're done using it for 10 years, which they're presumably going to want to do until 2050 or so, that entity will cost 60 billion euros, and then that's a sizable chunk of money to do something. In any case, even if you were guaranteed, when we sent astronauts to the moon existed, and we knew we could put people in space, but we didn't know exactly how it would come about, and so it was a research project that perhaps cost $100 billion in today's dollars. The question of what was the actual return, why did we actually go through that process of doing it just to say that we did it, is not really justifiable in terms of, what the money's kind of expenditure could be used to do. And so we have to ask ourselves, should you just do something because it's there? And in my case, in my opinion, this new accelerator upgrade, although I love physics and science, and I know that the money will be squandered presumably on useless things that aren't really even as capable as contributing to human knowledge, I feel compelled just by integrity to say as a scientist that I'm very dubious about the prospects of such an instrument. So while I applaud the technology and the kind of entitlement project for scientists and my colleagues across the pond, I do not really feel like they've convinced the scientific community that there's a justification for doing so.
No, absolutely. And it might seem totally unrelated what you do in your world, looking at the cosmic microwave background and what goes on at CERN. But literally, there was you looking for the moments right after the Big Bang, while down at CERN, below ground, they're recreating those initial moments after the Big Bang. So do you get any kind of advantage or any knowledge from the data that they produce that helps you at all, Brian?
Very minimally so. So the thing to know is that a physicist measures things in terms of logarithmic quantities, or if you like, exponential quantities. In other words, a temperature of 0 Celsius is interesting when you compare it to 10 Celsius, but it's not as interesting as 10 to the minus 10 Celsius. In other words, it's the exponents that really matter. And so while it's true that there was a period of time in the early evolution of the universe when the universe had an energy that was comparable to the energy scales produced by the Large Hadron Collider currently, or perhaps 6 times larger after spending upwards of $60 billion US. They might achieve 6 times the energies. That really only corresponds to a very, very minute improvement in logarithmic time, if that makes sense to you. It's not even an order of magnitude. So it would be as if and the effects that we're looking for in the Big Bang correspond to energy scales 1 trillion times larger than the energy scales of even these largest particle accelerators. And, there's a limit on Earth. If you make a circular particle accelerator, you can't make it bigger than the equator of the Earth, right? There's no way to do that and keep it as at least a single circle. If you think about it, right, you start making it smaller after a while. And so the question as to what could you do with an accelerator the size of the Earth, it's still as pitiful in comparison to the energies that the universe, the most effective particle accelerator in history, produced. And that behooves scientists like myself to want to understand the early universe as our laboratory rather than build more powerful earthly laboratories. I'm not saying it's not worth doing, although the cost has to be justified. Somebody has to come up with that money. And it's not at all clear that that's the most effective way to really, if that's your goal to glimpse the early universe, there are far better ways to go about it.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, you see a lot of talk on the internet, and back before I really started to learn about CERN, I was probably quite fearful of them creating black holes and stuff like that. But that isn't technically what could happen there, right? They're not going to go and create a black hole on us, are they?
No. That was sort of a publicity, kind of, concern that people had, and no, that was completely, flash in the pan, the cosmic blip on the radar, so to speak. That was it's completely irrelevant effect.
See, I can sleep easier tonight now. But we're talking about the origins there, going back to the Big Bang, stuff like that, and you have had the pleasure of the honor of talking many times, I believe, with Sir Roger Penrose. Yeah. And I was listening to him just recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I can't wait to hear you on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think you'd make a perfect guest for that. But he was talking about dark matter, dark energy, and this is something we hear a lot about in the media. Even people that aren't anywhere near science have all heard about dark energy, dark matter. But what's your kind of take on all of this after speaking to Roger Penrose?
Yeah, he's such an incredible intellect, and he is one of the original pioneers of what I call this maverick band of astrophysics, where you look for things that are unconventional, that are contrarian, that are controversial. And he's unafraid to do that. He's this petite gentleman, 5'7" or something tall. He's got this intellectual force of, you brought up Joe Rogan. He's sort of the mental equivalent of Joe Rogan's, physique. So, I think his ideas are controversial. They're by no means mainstream, but maybe that's okay. And so I don't subscribe to most of his ideas. In fact, we've had very friendly debates, and he couldn't be more charming, and I couldn't be more honored that he gave the endorsement from the back of my book when it came out earlier last year. That really it spoke to him, and one of the highest accolades that I received was that he told me that he learned from me, and that's very humbling. As a young man who read his books as a teenager and was influenced to become a scientist because of him, to get an accolade from him. But again, the job of science is not to venerate individuals. Albert Einstein made tremendous numbers of blunders and errors. And there's no one, kind of authority in science. It's another bias that astronomers, physicists have. It's called authority bias, that we think that because we know about X, that we also know about Y, and because we are so brilliant when it comes to X, that extends into a halo effect around Y. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I think that's another thing that the book describes, is how this has come to be. And the Nobel Prize sort of confers the ultimate halo on somebody. Once you hear it, there's almost nothing else that you need to know about somebody, which is unfortunate.
No, you're quite right there, though. It almost adds some kind of imaginary kind of weight to whatever they're about to say if you hear that they're a Nobel Prize winner. And, Dr. Penrose as well, he's been talking a lot about consciousness. And that's something that we talk a lot about here on the show, or at least we like to speculate about, because what even is consciousness? So what's your take on this thing that we call consciousness? And what's your thoughts when you hear people like Geordie Rose, the man behind D-Wave and also Sanctuary AI, when he talks about lifelike robots literally becoming conscious? Do you think that's even possible?
Yeah, this is a fascinating subject to me, and it ties in, as you say, to Roger Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind, which was the book that influenced me back in 1988 or so when it came out, and I was still a freshman in high school or something at the time. And just thinking about it with his unique, charming way of explication had a deep influence on me as a scientist, as a writer, etc. But I would say the thing that's, there are three Big Bangs in the universe that I would like to know about. One is the Big Bang itself, the origin of the universe, perhaps the origin of time, our current cosmos. I'd like to know what happened 15 minutes before that occurred. Does that even make sense, or is it as nonsensical as asking what is north of the North Pole, as Stephen Hawking, your late great countryman, used to call such a question? Nowadays, we think, even according to Roger Penrose, there may be a very good answer to such a question, in a so-called cyclic or bouncing cosmological scenario, which you can read about in his books, or and briefly touched upon in my books, or books by Paul Steinhardt, who would make another wonderful guest for your show. And so I think about that as one of the most puzzling mysteries in the universe, the Big Bang itself. Then, how did life come about from what was formerly hydrogen and helium? How do you get life from inorganic, non-living material? That is a Big Bang, a creation of something ex nihilo, completely different character. How do you get biology from pure chemistry, chemistry from pure physics, and physics, from pure nothingness if the universe originated ex nihilo? And then the last Big Bang that fascinates my scientific curiosity is the origin of consciousness. So we perceive consciousness, we sort of believe that we have it, and yet there are these great, vast difficulties in pinning down what does consciousness even mean, and what are the different levels of consciousness. And in any case, how did it come to be? And Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, who's located at University of Arizona as anesthesiologist, knows a lot about making people unconscious. But, is that the same as consciousness, just the absence of unconsciousness? There are many people who believe things that I find ludicrous, that electrons are conscious, and inanimate objects, neutrons, protons, croutons are conscious. I find it somewhat laughable at a certain level, but the fact that there's no lexicon for unraveling this is a great puzzle, and I think those are the most interesting things to study that one could possibly study. These three origin stories that we are just really scratching the surface on understanding, and it's such a privilege to be a scientist, getting paid to do these things on a daily basis.
No, exactly. And consciousness. Perhaps it's one of the few things, maybe the only thing that we won't ever be able to wrap our heads around, because
that may be. Yeah, I thought about that very thing, Kevin.
We're using our brains, which have a certain kind of processing power, and we're using it to figure out about that processing power and just beyond. Maybe we just can't conceptualize what it is at all.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the computer can't think about itself. Maybe, there are certain very good things that quantum computers can do, for example, but they're very abstract. I mean, they're terrible at doing things like, playing Sudoku and just simple things, or recognizing a picture of a cat. Anything that my 2-year-old could do. That they find it very difficult to do that, even for vast, powerful artificial intelligences. It takes, and they parameterize the success rate of, say, doing menial tasks, crossing the street, recognizing pictures of cats, facial expressions, and they have success rates of 80% or something like that, after billions of attempts and cycles of such attempts. So the question of, can you is there something secret, some magic pixie dust that we just cannot program into the computer to study about itself? Or are we just bound, within this box, this brain in a box that can think about anything, outside of the box itself, but really is incapable of understanding the ghost in the machine that is doing the thinking? And certainly we perceive the notion of consciousness in human beings very different from, the existence and the intelligence or syntax or ability of communication of other living creatures. And so it's very different. I think human beings are very special. And it's something wonderful that we get to figure out, or attempt to figure out, what's going on inside this 3-pound computer on top of our shoulders.
You mentioned somebody called Stuart Hameroff there a few moments ago, and a fascinating presentation I've watched of his about the quantum brain, and it really is. It's a great watch if you're into science, but something really interesting at that, and it was a talk from a good few years ago, and there was a very young gentleman called Eric Ladzinski watching this absolutely intently, taking notes on the quantum functions of the brain, and Eric Ladosinski went on to create the D-Wave, which is, of course, one of the world's first and most powerful quantum computers. So literally taking notes of how our own quantum computer works and then artificially replicating it. I think that's genius.
Yeah, it is a very powerful approach, and certainly that they've been able to do, kind of maximize the current early potential of the field. The question of just the history of computation, when you look back at, say, the semiconductor, if you had built the first semiconductor and you had asked, well, will you someday have a smartphone in your pocket? The answer would, probably be completely, ludicrous to even think about back then in the 40s and 30s. But nowadays, we just take it for granted. Things are getting faster, more powerful, cheaper, better in every way. The question is, what happens when that happens with quantum computers? Right now, it does seem like the things that quantum computers are best at doing is sort of reflexive in that they're basically good at solving quantum mechanical problems and doing, kind of computation of problems that are challenging for semiconductor computers, classical computers. That doesn't mean that that's all they'll ever be able to do. But I think right now to say that because it's quantum and because there may be quantum processes occurring in synapses, that the logical syllogism then extends that quantum computers will solve the problem of consciousness. I'm not convinced of that at this point, but I'm hoping to be surprised.
Absolutely. And, we're coming up on the end of our discussion right now, but I hope to get you back in the near future. And we spoke about the project that you're working on, the follow-up to the BICEP. What other kind of things happening out there in space, in the cosmos, different kind of missions? What have you got your eye on right now, Brian, for people to kind of check out?
Well, I think some of the most mysterious things that we're learning about the cosmos have to do with very big, very vast surveys of the universe in what's called time domain astronomy. So, how do you measure changes in the night sky? So it used to be, the word planet means wanderer in Greek, and it really owes the fact that most things in the skies don't change, right? So they had a name for the few things that did move around. But nowadays we know that there's a tremendous number of things that change. So you mentioned these fast radio bursts; those are incredibly mysterious objects. The existence of these black holes that coalesce and produce vast energy showers in the form of cosmic gravitational radiation. If you look at the properties of the elusive neutrino particle, which is the only form of dark matter that we know exists. It's not the dominant form potentially, but so these mysteries of the composition of nature, the energy, the nature of energy and matter at the earliest times, and then how it evolves in time. It's the very first time in history when we've really made movies of the universe in all different sensory kind of bands. And I think to add the last bit to it, the notion of the properties of nature at its most fundamental level, namely the behavior of quantum mechanics, and the existence of how quantum systems behave and how that might relate to things like the human perception of consciousness. Those are really fascinating things, and they may all be interlinked through this vast cosmic web that we get to study.
Absolutely, and the fast radio bursts, that's definitely something I keep my eye on. And if you had to speculate, I mean, what would you say is causing that? Some kind of pulsar, quasar that we aren't aware of, something like that?
Yeah, they're so mysterious right now that we're just really able to capture the first repeating versions of this. Some of my colleagues in Canada and elsewhere captured the first repetition of these signals. So it'd be one thing if you saw it once and it never came back again. You would have a very limited perspective on it. And some things in astronomy only happen once, right? If you have a black hole or a supernova and it blows up, well, that's only going to happen once. But there's many of those that occur, and then through the acquisition of statistics, one learns more about the properties of the subset itself. So I think we're going to learn a tremendous amount about them. We need to collect more data and do a little bit more, taxonomy of these objects and what kind of properties, what kind of bursts, study them at different energies and timescales. We'll learn about them. I wouldn't want to speculate as to what they are. And typically, they if they're fast, they have to be small. And small is relative. It could be the size of our solar system or even a fraction of a galaxy, but it can't be incredibly large and repeat and interact on very, very short timescales. Just limitations.
So it's nothing like the movie Contact then?
It could be, some people are speculating it could be a communications, and we just don't have we haven't unraveled them. But the first kind of stake in the ground, the equivalent to Galileo turning his tiny telescope to the skies as he did on this very date in 1610, would be, not too far from the truth if these things turn out to be really important objects for the study of astronomy.
So, Brian, where can people keep up to date with all your work? Where can they get the book, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so the book's available online, typical places, Amazon.com, and several places in the UK. I know you can get them and elsewhere in the US. And then I maintain a website, as you said, briankeating.com, BrianKeating. I have a YouTube channel where you can find the interviews with Sir Roger Penrose and Paul Steinhardt and soon to be Freeman Dyson and many other great luminaries. And then lastly on Twitter, Dr.
Podcast as well on iTunes. I subscribe to
Correct.
That today. Yeah, that's the is it Into the Impossible?
Yeah, that's the name of the podcast. Yeah, if you go to imagination.ucsd.edu, you'll find our podcast, Into the Impossible.
Well, we are out of time, and hopefully we'll get you back sometime really soon. We'll go for the phone option right from the start next time so we don't have any of those pesky Skype interruptions. But, Brian, I wish you all the best with the project that you're working on right now. I can't wait to have you back on in the near future to catch up on that and everything else that's going on in the skies and beyond.
I would love that, Kev. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Absolutely brilliant. And I'll have a quick word with you during the break before we go. But folks, don't worry, because coming up after the break, I'll be joined by Jimmy Jeans, 1 hour down and 1 hour to go. So I'll be catching up with Jimmy. Haven't spoken to him in a little while. And of course, don't forget Joe Joseph. He will be coming up here later on the show as well. So we've had Dr. Brian Keating with us tonight. A lot to think about there, and talked about a lot of the subjects that myself and Johnny Whistles and Jimmy and Scott and Joe, we always like to speculate on. So I'm going to have to certainly listen to that hour of radio again. There's a lot of great information in there. And I urge you all, check out the book, Losing the Nobel Prize. And also, don't forget, check out the previous episode that I done with Brian, because that gives us the real inside story on what led to that book and what led Brian to have his suspicions about the Nobel Prize. We'll be back after the break, ladies and gentlemen. Don't go anywhere.